Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final edition of the Friday seminar for the winter quarter. I am pleased to introduce our two speakers with us today, Carolyn Abrams and Henry McKay. Carolyn is a senior transportation planner for Caltrans and manages the Priority Populations Program in the Director's Office of Equity, Sustainability, and Tribal Affairs. Carolyn has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from UCLA and a BS in Community and Regional Development here at UC Davis. Carolyn has 8 years of professional experience doing policy-oriented research and solutions-based community planning and engagement, and coordinates, in her current role, coordinates the multi-agency efforts to address the harms of California's transportation system with the end goal of implementing policies and practices that better serve our communities. And Henry McKay is a sustainable transportation analyst for Caltrans, working on the SB 743 implementation team in the Director's Office of Equity, Sustainability, and Tribal Affairs. He's also a planner, holds a BS in City and Regional Planning, and a minor in statistics from Cal Poly. The other Cal Poly, I went to Cal Poly.
I think it's the better one, honestly.
Yeah. His current work involves the development and implementation of multimodal access to destinations, project performance, metrics, and equity-focused spatial analysis tools that we're going to talk a little bit about today. And prior to that, he worked on travel demand forecasting, network integration, and planning projects for rail and transit projects in California. So a lot of great stuff that our presenters have been doing. So I'm excited to learn about the work on the Transportation Equity Index. Without further ado. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jesus. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn Abrams, and this is Henry McKay. Thank you for these introductions. I guess we don't have to reintroduce ourselves. But it is really wonderful to be here today. I worked at UC Davis for a number of years with the UC Davis Center for Regional Change before taking my position at Caltrans. So it's wonderful to be back on campus, and I appreciate all of you being here today and your interest in our equity index. So I will kick us off, and then I'm going to let Henry do the bulk of the technical presentation. But to set us up, I wanted to really give you all a sense of where the equity index stemmed from and really what the impetus was for developing this tool. So essentially, and if any of you are familiar with this, we have a Caltrans equity statement, which is in recent years has been a big shift, I think, in our public approach to equity and transportation equity and everything that comes with that. So our equity statement is really an acknowledgement that communities of color and marginalized communities have been disproportionately harmed by our transportation system. And they also share basically more of the burdens and receive fewer of the benefits. So the recognition that this has happened through our planning and our policies and all of these practices over the years is something that Caltrans is grappling with. They're acknowledging it, and now we are trying to do better and be better. So part of that is really where this equity index comes in. So it's essentially a way that we can operationalize our equity statement. And essentially with the equity index, and I won't read all of this for you, but this is going to allow us to really integrate equity in the work that we do at Caltrans, which will hopefully help mitigate current harms and also prevent any future harms with our transportation system. So broadly speaking, and sorry, let me back up really quick. So essentially, I'll give you the rundown of our vision for this tool and potential applications for it, and then I'll hand it over to Henry to really get into the bulk of what the tool entails. So bear with me for a little bit. But essentially, the EQI has several objectives. So we are really trying to capture transportation-specific and socioeconomic indicators that will allow us to advance equitable outcomes in our transportation system. So we're going to do this through the identification of priority populations and having that backed by data. And then we also want to use the EQI essentially to support the development of guidance around our planning processes and have a better way to analyze project impacts and essentially improve the development process, our planning, our design, all of that. And then as an external focus tool as well, we do also envision other agencies using this, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But at the end of the day, Caltrans has a very specific vision for integrating this into all of the work that we do. So a few considerations at the state level where the equity index is relevant is essentially our climate action plan for transportation infrastructure, which is something that came down from the California State Transportation Agency. Essentially, CAPTI for short is, it calls for the equity index to be used in the evaluation and prioritization of Caltrans projects. And then it also calls for the equity index to support different analyses within our program requirements. So we're using the tool in alignment with some of these other statewide imperatives, essentially. And then another example of how the EQI comes into play is it satisfies the statutory requirement, which is set forth under the Reconnecting Communities Highways to Boulevards pilot program. So for those of you that are familiar, in 2021, essentially the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was established, or essentially established a discretionary grant program to reconnect communities that have been literally divided by transportation infrastructure. So this federal grant program is going to support planning and capital improvements and provide other technical assistance to restore community connectivity. And the vision is that we can use the EQI to inform this work. And then at the federal level, there is something called Justice 40, which essentially the federal government has made it a goal that 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments will be given directly to disadvantaged communities. So again, as it stands, Justice 40 has only been, we've only been provided sort of loose guidance on how this will be implemented. So thinking ahead, we are envisioning the EQI as an opportunity to align our work with Justice 40. Okay, so just to frame the conversation before we get into the tool itself, I'm sure a lot of you are curious to know what the tool will be used for. I want to be really clear that as we're developing the EQI, this is still a very, very much in like the brainstorm process in terms of applications of the tool. So we think that there is a lot of potential for using this tool. As it stands right now, we have not identified or written into any legislation the use of this tool. So it's definitely still in flux. But to give you guys a sense of how this tool could be used, there are informational components. So specific to Caltrans, this would be like project reviews or early in the project development process. We have like the project initiation document that essentially is like the beginning of any project. And so, leveraging the EQI could be an opportunity for folks to really identify data to back up the benefits of their project when it comes to equity. It can also be used in environmental reviews. And then we've also discussed opportunities for it to be used for funding allocation. So a lot of discretionary grant programs, the potential for it to be written into program guidelines, such as the SB1 program that the commission oversees. And then in terms of decision-making, there's a myriad of potential applications of the tool, but corridor and area planning, different project prioritization, And then essentially, like through all of this, but also as a standalone piece, equity assessments in general could also potentially be used for performance measurement over time, things like that. So internally, I won't get too into the weeds, but we've been talking to folks from environmental, we've been talking to folks that are involved with our, state highway, management plan. So a lot of ways that we see this tool being used, but it's definitely still in the developmental piece of, or phase of things, so. Okay, perfect. All right, so just to place you all in our timeline, essentially this tool has been under development for quite some time. And we are now at the public beta release of the tool. So I think as of yesterday or the day before, the beta version is now on our website and folks can access the data sets. And essentially, we are now diving into round 3, which is of our engagement, which is more of an external stakeholder engagement process. So with that, we are now consulting with other partner agencies, different target audiences, and I'll get into this in detail toward the end of the presentation. But we are now hoping that folks will, test out the tool, try and break it, give us critical feedback, and really have some conversations with people about the tool as it's in its early stage of development. So we've handed it over to you.
Carolyn. So I'll get into a little bit some of the technical details of how we've been developing the equity index. Starting out with some of the kind of high level principles we've been trying to kind of adhere to, we think are really important. So first, we're really focused on granularity. A lot of equity tools or spatial screening tools that include a lot of different indicators typically aren't super spatially granular, usually using like census tracts. And for the specific transportation burdens, benefits, and other types of issues we're looking at, they tend to be really granular in nature. So just taking sort of an average across the census tracts, especially in more rural areas, isn't always a really great way of screening for issues. So we really wanted to focus on stuff that we can measure granularly or in a granular way. We also sort of narrowed our focus down to spatially significant indicators. There's a lot of equity issues, transportation related and otherwise, that just aren't really spatially significant either, and that they can't really be represented on a map in like literal sense, or their just kind of distribution throughout the state isn't significant in a way with transportation, or us, developing screens would really actually target resources in the communities that are most impacted. And so this has been an issue throughout of sort of identifying which issues we can actually do a good job of addressing spatially. We also want to focus kind of narrowly on issues that we can, help address and hopefully improve with transportation decision making, and even more so within the Department of Transportation. So again, there's a lot of tools out there that kind of try to serve this role for lots of different programs and different entities. We really wanted to focus on something that's very, very narrowly focused towards transportation. Then lastly, it's just a general philosophy. We want to try to avoid double counting. So you'll see a lot of tools, there'll be transportation externalities that would stem from something like traffic being measured as a lot of different things. We kind of wanted to, where we could just measure that single point source in a way, like a single indicator, and avoid sort of double counts. So with these sort of principles in mind, we've arrived at a pretty narrow set of indicators that we can broadly group together as transportation burdens, transportation benefits, but really what we're trying to screen for is the lack of benefits that the system provides, as well as some racial, ethnic, demographic data that we use to kind of look at these transportation indicators in the context of. So for transportation burdens, we're looking at truck-weighted traffic volume essentially, as well as a crash exposure indicator. For the benefits, we're really operationalizing that as access to destinations or accessibility. We're focused on multimodal access to a number of different destination types. And then lastly, for demographics, we have a fairly simple screen that just looks at household income. I'll get a little bit more into how we're doing that, as well as race and ethnicity. And so I'm going to come back to this slide at the end. It will make more sense, but I kind of just want to set the stage. We're developing, these indicators in service of developing screens for PQI. That's really how it works at the end of the day. So we have different screens that, flag different areas throughout the state. And so we're developing 3 screens at this point: the traffic exposure screen, the access to destination screen, and the priority populations screen. And again, we'll come back to this and it'll make more sense later on. So I'll start out by kind of laying out how we're measuring demographics. We call this the demographic overlay. And we're looking at first household income. We're basically using statutes defined by AB 1550. So it's consistent with what CARB does. And so we're basically just looking at any census block that's below 80% the statewide median household income, or below the county-specific low-income threshold as defined by the Department of Housing and Community Development, which takes into account average household size. We're also looking at race and ethnicity in this measure because a big part of this tool is trying to address harms that have been caused in the past to certain groups, in large part due to transportation decision making. And so while there is some overlap, we feel like just a low-income screen is sufficiently capturing all of these issues. So for that, we're just looking at census blocks that are greater than 63% non-white, which is the statewide average. It used to be 50, narrowed it down a little bit. And so generally speaking, we're covering transportation burdens as sort of 2 key indicators. First, traffic proximity and volume and crash exposure data. And I'll explain in a sec how these are calculated, but basically for inclusion in the screen, we're looking at if a census block exceeds the 80th percentile for either of those measurements. So I'll talk a little bit about specifically the traffic proximity and volume indicator and how we operationalize that. We're using input data from the Highway Performance Monitoring System, which covers the national highway system, state highway system, a lot of local arterials that are part of the national highway system as well. And so we're taking that input data, which is just linear, and we're buffering it out from the center line in 50 meter increments out to 500 meters, intersecting that with blocks, census blocks. Then we're inverse distance decay weighting those values. So you can see on the right, this graph sort of shows how that looks as you go out from, just right next to the highway to about 500 meters away. And generally, we're following kind of the approach taken by the EPA's environmental justice screening tool. They do a similar thing to this, but it's using a census of tracts. So the blocks are able to kind of capture that on a more granular level. And we're also weighting things by truck values. So we're taking a pretty simple approach at this point. We're basically assuming that 1 truck equals 6 cars, which follows the sort of emission profiles of PM 2.5, which is one of the importance we're looking at. But this could certainly become more sophisticated as we kind of look at more things involved, more comprehensive weighting factor. But we do want to count trucks heavier in this case. And then lastly, this metric covers cumulative impact. So take, for example, a census block in Los Angeles, where you're maybe 300 meters away from a highway facility, and then you have 2 local high volume arterials within a few hundred meters of you. It's going to be able to capture the additive burden of all those facilities. And so I'll show a map in a sec that kind of shows the areas that really light up in the higher percentiles are mostly those that are either by really big facility or just near a bunch of facilities. So this is kind of how this looks statewide. Again, expresses percentiles. And it's not super surprising. I mean, areas around just the highway system tend to light up here in about the 80th percentile. But you really see like in LA and certain other spots, really just the additive impact of the burdens you're getting from being close to highways and a lot of busy local roads. And so another part of the transportation sort of burden side of things that we're quantifying is crash exposure. And again, we're taking a pretty simple approach with this. We're using data from the Transportation Injury Mapping System, or TIMS, which is developed by UC Berkeley, using California Highway Patrol data. And we're mapping it. And first, we're sort of cleaning the data set by removing crashes that occur on controlled access facilities. And the reason we're doing this is the EQI isn't really trying to give you a network level metric. We're kind of concerned with how these crashes impact neighborhoods or kind of the areas around them. So we want to differentiate between crashes occurring on local arterial facilities or open access state highways and ramps to highways and things like that, from crashes that are occurring on closed access facilities behind sound walls, in elevated sections of the highway. You could run it with all the crashes and it actually doesn't affect the final metrics all too much, but this is one sort of step we're taking. So once we have our cleaned crash data, we weight the crashes by severity. And at this point, we're using weighting factors that we derive from the CalBC model, which is the benefit cost model that the department uses to do economic analysis. Again, this could change as a sort of assumptions change, but that's a pretty widely accepted weighting factor, and the federal government uses it. And then we're sort of aggregating those weighted crashes within census blocks. And importantly here, we're applying a 250-foot buffer around each census block because we want crashes that are occurring kind of the middle of the intersection or a center line. Usually that's going to be sort of the border of a block. And we don't want to arbitrarily have a crash be associated with one block or the other just because it's kind of 5 feet to the left of the border. And so we generally want crashes to be kind of associated with all the immediately surrounding blocks in that kind of neighborhood. So that's how we're approaching that. And then lastly, we're dividing the values by just the area to come up with kind of the density of measurement and then expressed as a percentile. So here's a map showing that, again, expressed in just percentiles. There is quite a bit of overlap between this and the previously shown traffic proximity and volume map, because lots of traffic volume does tend to drive more crashes. But this does bring in additional geographies where maybe there's less of a specific traffic burden, but more an abnormal amount of crashes. We want to be able to screen for that as well. So next I'll kind of talk about how we're looking at some transportation benefits. And we're doing this broadly with a metric we're calling access to destinations. It's also referred to commonly in literature as accessibility or access. It's basically on a simple level a measure of how much stuff can you get to on the transportation system, and how hard is it to get to that stuff, what's the cost associated. We feel like this is a really good kind of comprehensive metric that covers a lot of benefits. That's good for measuring projects. And so just as a starting place on this, kind of conceptually, we are kind of making the assumption that if you live in California, you have the money to have a car, so you can have a car. You're of the age where you can drive a car, and you don't have a disability maybe that would drive it. That you generally have pretty good access to things, because we spent the last 50 years really building out our transportation network to accommodate cars. And so we're choosing instead to mostly look at multimodal access to destinations, which is not car access. So transit and walking. And the way we're expressing this in the equity index is really looking at the ratio of stuff you can get to with multimodal modes to auto. What we're saying is if this ratio is above 0.2, so if you can get to more than at least or more than 20% of the things you can get to by car, by walking and taking the bus or transit, you statewide have pretty good access. If you can get to less than 20% of the things that you have poor access. And the way this breaks down statewide is most of the state falls under that sort of poor access category. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we calculate this in a sec, but I will mention we are working on a new metric that will be included in the equity index, either version 1 or version 2, specifically designed to sort of look at gaps in the bike network. So we are trying to be fully sort of multimodal as well. So I'll do a quick slide on just how we're calculating access to destinations. Basically, on the network side of things, we're using OpenStreetMap networks, which is kind of the data source that we can use for like a statewide thing, an easy way. It does include, off facility, just like standalone type stuff. And it's pretty common in these type of analyses. We're also using a statewide general transit fee specification data set, or GTFS, to represent our transit networks. And Caltrans has done a really, really good job of compiling all that data into one really usable feed, which would have made this really, much more difficult if we had over 300 agencies in the state. So as far as how we're actually measuring access to destinations, if you're familiar with literature, there's a lot of different ways to do it. We're kind of going with the simplest, which is just cumulative opportunities, that approach. You can see on the right here, I think this GIF kind of illustrates the concept. You can think of the blue dot as like your origin for measuring access for, and showing you the least cost path in this case to all the other analysis zones in Sacramento County. And you can see this blue dot just keeps moving, so we're doing that measurement for every origin point. And above it, you can see in mathematically expressed is the formula to do access. So another important note here is we're measuring access to a whole lot of different things, work and non-work destinations, and we are sort of decay weighting things. So, a school that takes 5 minutes to get to is going to be worth more under this metric than a school that takes an hour to get to. So that's how we're kind of accounting for the so we're running these calculations for the entire state using 200-meter grid cells, which means it's a lot of processing. It's millions of origin points. What it does allow us to do is get a really, really granular measurement of how access to destinations looks. So even in rural areas where census blocks are bigger, maybe, than we'd like them to be for this type of analysis, instead of just measuring from like the centroid of that block, we can run analysis for kind of the whole area around that block and then take sort of an average that we actually express in that events. Then just kind of a fun technical note if you're into this stuff, computing, we're using the open source R5 routing engine, which is developed by Conveil, which I can't recommend highly enough. It's really easy to work with in like modern Python. And it's the only thing stopping us from doing this totally open source is just the scale. So if you're just doing kind of neighborhood level stuff or trying to analyze this for county, it's pretty easy to do just fine. So it's exciting that open source tools are. I'll show a few maps kind of showing how this looks, the access to destinations indicator breaks down statewide. Again, these maps are showing that ratio of multimodal access to auto access. The reason we're doing that is because we want to build we want it to be a relative metric. And, of course, San Francisco, downtown San Francisco is going to have way higher job density and just, absolute number of jobs and a more robust transit network than Chico, for example. But we want to look at kind of, how is access in multimodal lens relative to the auto access? And auto access in those more rural places is also going to be lower just because of the lower number of destinations. So the places that kind of get screened as have poor access in this metric are going to tend to be those places that have really sprawling land uses and transit network, block network that really can't accommodate. So Sacramento's a good example. Our non-work destinations tend to be pretty distributed, regionally. It's hard to get to it, over. So the previous map was showing work access, and this is showing non-work access. The two generally track fairly strongly together throughout the state. But like I mentioned, there are some key differences in the way jobs versus non-work destinations are distributed, especially in places with kind of strong downtown job centers. And so we're looking at both of these, and it's kind of either or. If you have poor access for one or the other, you're included in the screen. Although it's usually they track. So I'll preview this metric, which we're sort of tentatively calling the ideal access metric. And we're designing this specifically to look at like works in the index. It's the previous two metrics I showed are kind of more geared towards like regional scale transit. At a simple level, what this is really doing is just comparing what your actual on the network access is to what your ideal access would be. And By ideal, we mean if you could literally just bike in a straight line wherever you wanted to go without any impedance caused by the network. So what this allows us to do is kind of identify where the gaps are the highest, and it allows us to explain those gaps in terms of either basically level of traffic stress issues. So, maybe you have a good street network, but there's a lot of cars and not a lot of bike lanes. And so that's kind of keeping you from being able to get to things easily on a bike. And that would sort of inform certain project types. Or we can also explain how much of the gap is explainable by circuities. So you might have a fine street network with good bike facilities, but you have a rail line that just bisects the town and no good crossings. So that would kind of inform a different project type, perhaps. And, so it helps you kind of think clearer about how your gaps line up. You can see here, this is an example of Sacramento and today's as well. The high areas are red, that's showing where the gap is kind of the smallest, and the green is the lowest. And a lot of the kind of uninhabited areas are obviously gonna have the lowest access here. So kind of in these areas are kind of where are of most interest, where there is a road network and people actually live, but there are some pretty significant gaps. So I showed this slide previously, but we'll return to it now that we've kind of gone through the various indicators. The EQI is operationalized as having 3 screens that are screening parts of the state for these various indicators. And I'll run through these real quick. So first we have the traffic exposure screen, which is basically looking at parts of the state that are low income and or mostly non-white. But that also are the most burdened by the transportation system, either in terms of a lot of exposure to traffic externalities and crashes, or either of those. And then the access to destination screen is looking at parts of the state that are low income and or mostly non-white, that also have the least amount of access to destinations, so that are being sort of the least served by the multimodal transportation. When I show the map here in a sec, this actually ends up being a lot of the state, but we could, you can look more narrow as well. And then lastly, we have a priority population screen, which we're kind of designing as the one to really identify what are the biggest issues are. So this again is looking at lower income, mostly non-white communities that are the most burdened by the transportation system, as measured in that traffic exposure and crash exposure, but are also, have the least amount of benefits. So those are really the focus area. Now, in some cases, it's a case where you have a lot of traffic exposure, but you're in kind of a downtown area where you have relatively good multimodal accessibility. But we really want to focus on those areas where you don't have that, so you kind of get the worst of all of it. So this map shows the demographic overlays I mentioned. This is just kind of the demographic data underpinning those other transportation indicators. It's a fairly broad definition, so it covers about 71% of the state to begin with. So it's a lot of areas of potential to be screened in. So, now though, we can look at the traffic exposure screen. So again, this is looking at traffic volume, exposure or crash exposure. And this gets much narrower, at least in terms of the coverage when you see the map. It only covers about 26% of the state's population. But that's still a quarter, and it's kind of explainable by, a lot of these areas that are screened, in big cities and by major highways do tend to be fairly high population density. So it is a sizable share of the state's population. So, like I said, with access to destinations, the way we're measuring this now, it does tend to cover a pretty broad amount of the state, 61% of the population. You can see there are areas in San Francisco, East Bay, Los Angeles, as well as some places, in the northern state and in the Central Valley that do, for the reasons how we're measuring it, have relatively good access, either as a function of having really robust transit networks relative to the rest of the state, or having kind of dense, downtown cores where a lot of the destinations you can reach. But again, it is a much broader screen, covers quite a bit of the state. And then lastly, this is the priority population screen, which is the most narrowly focused, as I mentioned. It still covers about a fifth of the state's population, though. And this is kind of, you can think of this as kind of looking at where those burdens are worst via the traffic exposure, but removing the areas that also have good multimodal access. So yeah, it's kind of sort of the areas we'd expect, a lot of more urbanized areas with a lot of major highways, major roads, but that maybe aren't going to get the benefits that we have kind of for downtown core of really dense land uses, robust transit. And so that sort of concludes its overview of how this tool works on a really basic level and what the information is that we're including in it. I'm going to end with just a quick comparison to some other equity tools out there, because this is something we think about a lot and get asked about, are kind of really trying to clearly explain how it's different, where the differences are and whatnot. So for this, I'll just focus on Caltrans screen, the federal climate and economic justice screening tool, which is part of the Justice 40 initiative. So in terms of transportation burdens, all the tools, including ours, are covering traffic. We're also looking at crashes as well. Some of these other tools are looking at, they break out the diesel, the PM 2.5, and some of these noise, other externalities sort of separately from the traffic. We're kind of doing that. As far as benefits are concerned, Caltrans screen doesn't really look at that for transportation. On the federal side, they're looking at some sort of high-level cost of travel analysis. We're taking a different approach by looking at more granular sort of multimodal access to destinations. And then on the demographics, Caltrans screen includes quite a few different indicators. The federal tool only includes income, and we're kind of more so in the middle with looking at income, race, and ethnicity as well. Perhaps the biggest difference in analysis here is the unit of sort of geographic measurement. So, again, Caltrans screen and the climate and economic justice screening tool, as well as some others, do census tracts. We're using census blocks, which allows for granular analysis, kind of like spreading our distribution of coverages more evenly throughout the state. And so, at a high level, one thing we're really interested in is how much of the state is being covered and included in these screens. And so, for Caltrans screen via SB 535, we could look at what are the top 25% of tracks in Caltrans screen, as well as what's the disadvantaged community definition from the federal side. Compare that to the priority population screen QI on a number of metrics, but as far as like statewide population coverage goes, we're the most narrow. This tool covers about 20% of the population. Caltrans screen, their sort of screen covers about 25%, and then the Justice 40 tool covers nearly 40%, so it's much higher now. And if we look at this breakdown by county, that's another kind of concern is, what's the geographic equity of this look like? Are we focusing on our coverage in one spot, or is it kind of spread out? And on average, the equity index that we're developing is going to cover less of a given county's population than maybe some of the other tools will, but it's kind of more evenly spread out. Caltrans screen in a lot of counties is going to cover a much higher percentage of the county because of use of census tracts and more indicators, but there are also counties that just have basically no coverage. For the Justice 40 definition, coverage across the board is generally just going to be higher because and I will note here, you see areas with EQI and Caltrans screen with no coverage. This is just looking at that most narrow priority population screen. We do have those other two screens that are specifically looking at traffic burdens and access to destinations, kind of on their own terms. And so those counties every county in the state is covered pretty robustly by at least one of those screens. And so I'll end on this slide just kind of showing a spatial comparison in Sacramento between Caltrans screen and Index. Of course, these are pretty different tools developed using different methodologies with sort of different purposes. But what this kind of illustrates is that we're trying to capture that within census tract variance that a tool like Caltrans screen can kind of average out. And so as a result of that, the coverage areas for these screens are going to be much narrower typically than we find in other tools. And what that kind of means is when you do project analysis, you have to think a little differently. So, it's common for common virus screening to be used in the transportation context of, does my project's centerline or alignment intersect with a disadvantaged community as identified by common virus screening? And is that equitable? In our case, that direct spatial sort of nexus is true in some cases, especially on the burden side. But for example, for like access to destinations, you could have a project that's going to be, building, say, a pedestrian bridge somewhere. It's going to, greatly increase access to destinations for multimodal options for a community that's screened by this tool, but that actual project's not going to exist in that census block. So, kind of requires you to think about, how is my project going to move the needle on any of these indicators, and how is that distributed spatially? And that is, a difficult thing. So we are developing a lot of other tools and metrics kind of associated with this, but also on our own around, analyzing project impacts for access to destinations, the project's going, things like that. So the idea is that the stuff's can be all integrated. You're going to be able to identify issues with this tool and then go, evaluate the project on what impact it's going to have. That is sort of the conclusion of the overview of what goes into the tool and how it works. I'll turn it back to Carolyn.
Awesome. Thanks, Henry. Okay, so now that you all have a sense of what the tool is and what it covers, what I want to talk about, which I'll just wrap up quickly on, is where we're at in the release of the tool and our engagement process that we're conducting. So you'll see that we're in the middle of our public engagement stretch right now. So we've shifted to an external focus where the beta tool has been posted online. We are now inviting feedback from folks and really trying to get some of the subject matter experts or end users of the tool to be in dialogue with us if there are any, red flags or concerns or questions. And then just thinking big picture, familiarizing people with the tool and making sure that there are people who will adopt the use of it. And we are hopeful that, the more familiar people are with the tool and the purpose that it serves, and if, folks are bought into, the fact that it's a robust equity tool, then we'll really allow, some substantial use of it down the road. So we will aim to release EQI 1.0 about mid-year this year. And then after that, we're going to spend most of the summer months really focused on those use case developments. So that'll really be looking at more specifically in the Caltrans scope of things, how this tool can be used and how it will be applied. And I touched on that a bit earlier. And then again, we will enter into another public review process, and then we anticipate that other iterations of the tool will be forthcoming next year as well. Okay, so in terms of our public engagement, there are several target audiences that we are trying to reach. This includes other state agencies and transportation agencies. And then we also are working to gather feedback from tribal governments and sovereign nations. We of course have our transportation industry and labor groups, and then environmental justice partners, NGOs, CBOs, and other research centers and institutes. And then our approach with our public engagement currently is that we are conducting a series of information sessions, and then this will really be similar to today, right? It will give folks an idea of what the tool is. And then we're going to hold targeted listening sessions with those audiences that we're trying to reach. So that will really be an opportunity for dialogue and maybe more of this like constructive feedback. And if there are any wrinkles in the tool that we need to work out, that's where we're hoping to identify those. And then concurrent with our external engagement, we are also coordinating with our partner agencies and making sure that folks are briefed on the tool and where we are in the rollout of using it. So that's taking place behind the scenes, essentially. So our first information session was in last September 2022. So we kicked off our outreach around the tool late last year, and essentially between that point in time and now, so our next information session, I didn't put the dates on here, but they are on our website, so we can always circulate that as well. But our next information session will take place at the end of this month. These are all open to the public, so folks are welcome to join. But this will essentially be an update on the beta EQI and any of the changes or developments that have been made since that September preview. And then our third information session will really be a focused conversation around the technical and methodological considerations. And then that takes us to session 4, where we plan to present our draft use cases of the tool. And then finally, the last session will be more of a Q&A and a dialogue, getting feedback from folks about those potential use cases and applications. And then in addition to the information sessions, the listening sessions will be conducted with each of our target audiences. And this will consist of standing convenings that, are already calendared for some of these groups. There are a lot of advisory bodies. For example, we have our Native American Advisory Council that we work with at Caltrans. So that would be an example of, a space where we would go, we could present on the tool, invite conversation around it. However, in addition to these standing convenings, we will also be scheduling additional listening sessions to make sure that we are capturing those audiences and anybody that has not been able to participate along the way. And I believe, that concludes everything. So at this point in time, I think there's ample time for questions and we're happy to chat.
Thank you. So the diesel emissions are considered in EQI under the tool.
Diesel emissions, any emission factor that's associated with transportation, traffic is broadly considered as traffic being the sort of point source for that. There's other sort of like CARB, and the way that like Cal and BioScreen approach sort of measuring those things separately. Diesel in a more limited case, but for the other emissions, there's other non-transportation sources of that. So we wanted to mostly focus on where is transportation exacerbating that the most, as well as how is that more granularly analyzed on a smaller scale than kind of an average.
So you are measuring like I know like certain communities have more burden from air quality. So you're accounting for those impacts in the tools somehow?
Yeah, we're looking at the transportation specific air quality externalities. And it is a good point about Cal and BioScreen is really useful because it breaks out these air quality issues that are caused by any point source, especially like ag in the Central Valley. And so we also wouldn't want to be exacerbating air quality issues with transportation that are even if they're occurring for other reasons. But
if maybe did you for some reason not leave out or it was not relevant any consideration like for gender, like the impact on gender, like in transportation it does safety in transportation, access to there's a long chain of bias against anything feminine basically, and the
I mean, yeah, that's a tough question. I would say generally, for the access to destination screen, what that's kind of incentivizing and showing is, we want to, make multimodal access better. And, the way we're looking at that right now is large part, transit, walking. And we understand that those things aren't, equally safe necessarily, on gender lines. And so I guess, again, it's not the equity index isn't really looking at every equity issue that exists, but if there were, specific projects or efforts to, make transit feel safer, for example, that would, score highly on this because it is sort of increasing accessibility, but it is also one of those things that's harder to measure.
that's a good question. Why is it hard to measure? I was trying to get into the tool, and there's like you can download the data. Like if we wanted to like play around and make a comment, like comments policy on CARB,
So,
now's the time.
yeah, now's a great time. There's an email on the site to reach us as well as our personal emails. Right now, the data is available for download. It's just a geodatabase with kind of the raw data. And we have documentation as well. We'll be updating that hopefully within the next week or so to have a little bit more instructions on how to work with just geodatabases and stuff. And we will be releasing a web map pretty soon to access the data that way as well, which should be easier.
Thank you for your presentation. In the accessibility component, the cost section, are you mostly considering travel time costs, or are you considering maybe affordability within that cost, and how is that factored in? And I guess maybe that first.
Okay, good question. So it's travel. We're kind of assuming really broadly at a high level it's travel time, and so. And even kind of as a starting place before we get to that, the decision to focus on multimodal access versus auto access is kind of rooted in the idea that owning a car and operating a car is expensive and not something that's available to everyone. Within the actual, multimodal access calculations, that's sort of tricky. The model we're using to do that statewide has really specific data needs. So we're able to do that just using GTFS transit data, look at what the travel time is. On the cost side for transit fares, it's a little harder because the way the transit fares are represented in that data isn't quite complete yet. Some agencies do a good job of it, others don't. And so if we were measuring, there are, I think, the technical tools at this point to measure accessibility just in terms of just pure travel, like dollar cost, just for like transit fares, for example. But then we'd be kind of thinking about like, okay, what's the equilibrium between that and travel time? And at this point, we're trying to just keep it more simple and do the cumulative opportunities with travel time approach. But it is a well taken point that, some like commuter rail systems and fare structures aren't always designed equitably, and that's definitely a concern.
Yeah. The other question that I had was, the index has like 3 sections, and I just wanted to know, like, in the actual final result, do they like weigh equally? Are they considered equally in the result of like how equitable the area is for the states being as it, or is maybe like accessibility weighted higher, or traffic and stuff is weighted, like how does that work into the final factor?
It kind of depends on the use case. We're still really developing those, but I would say the priority population screen that we presented last, which sort of includes all of that, that's really what we're designing to kind of do that high level look at where are the real priority areas, taking into account all these things. But each of the individual screens kind of in their own right are like just a useful project development tool. And, if you're just looking at a, bike ped project that you want to enhance accessibility and do it in an equitable way, you can just look at the, access to destination screen. And so we'll definitely be trying to put more guidance on exactly when you should be using different screens. But as far as right now, the uses between them would kind of be dictated on just what the use case is, and there would be like, different weights depending on which one you use.
So, a question: what kind of process elimination and number two is like personally I feel like these ways of focus on tradition, Caltrans, that's good, but maybe expand next or like Caltrans is moving on traditional maybe, for example, there's the Caltrans name. Why do you think the next
Starting with the first question you had about the process of elimination, that generally kind of followed first like a data availability and granularity question. So For example, one indicator we've been working with a lot, and we still plan to sort of represent eventually, I think, in the equity index when we can do it properly, is disability data. And so the sort of two issues we ran into with that were, A, just on where people are located, it's not very granular. And the types of investments that this would be informing in terms of that would be inherently really granular things, like where do we improve our ADA network and where there are specific areas of concern. The other limiting factor with that is when we do our calculations for access, we're using OpenStreetMap, which doesn't have sidewalk networks everywhere. So we're kind of unable to as accurately as we'd like account for every inaccessible curb and whatnot. So what that's really done is kind of set a clear priority for we need a statewide sidewalk network that's we can actually be feeding into these models, and that doesn't really exist right now. So that's kind of a priority that we're trying to figure out how we can get that. So I'd say, spatial issues are just data constraints we want to avoid. We want to only do things that we can really, analyze well. And then the second would sort of be, once you just start to add a lot of things into an index that's constructed like this, you just tend to screen a lot of places in. And so we wanted to kind of keep it narrowly focused for that specific use. And if we come up with a bunch of different use cases that kind of differ beyond this, then it maybe raises the question of if you analyze it in a different context. But for EVs, that's a good question. I think generally this is kind of focused towards multimodal things, which is a somewhat new direction for Caltrans, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, on a basic level, just off the top of my head for EVs, you can think of it as where are the really traffic burden areas, and more EVs in those areas would, help on certain air quality factors. And so you could maybe look at it that way, but there's of course other externalities with EVs. And so that's why I don't have a really great answer to right now, but we'll definitely be looking at more.
Catherine, you had a question?
Yes, so for the crash exposure, you said you did the sum divided by the block area to calculate density. And I guess another way could be dividing it by traffic exposure. So I just was wondering if you could talk about why you chose one over the other and kind of what the benefits of doing it by the block area are.
A lot of questions there that detailed. That was something we thought about a lot. Ideally, what we want to do is do a rate. And so if we had a perfect measurement of what's the bike and ped, or I guess if we were analyzing for bike and ped, but just what's the overall activity by mode as expressed in EMT or something within each granular block, then we could just calculate some sort of rate that I think would be sort of the ideal metric for this. We don't have that data, unfortunately. The federal guidance on this is that I was reading was to use if you do it at a tract level, to use commute mode share to work on bike or ped, to do a specific bike ped sort of exposure rate. So I think we'd like to get there eventually. In service of just developing something that generally works pretty well and identifies key areas of concern. The density measurement highlights a lot of areas that where there are higher concentrations of crashes. But I'll have to look at that because the AADT, I guess the big missing data component of that is the crash exposure does look at autos as well, but bike and ped is a really big focus, and the activity data around bike and ped is definitely less robust, and we have less of it than the AADT. So for cars, so I think going to some sort of rate like that you mentioned is.
So if this EQI tool is subsequently used by any state agency to apportion money anywhere, how would you take the demographics, you take race and ethnicity into account, how would that hold up to any judicial scrutiny? Because you're apportioning money based on race.
Yeah, we've been, this is a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So we've been in conversation with our legal division about this exact topic because, and I think some of this is still pending, there's a case right now.
Supreme Court case,
Yeah.
so this could change, but.
they've given us the green light, and apparently, so far so good, but that could change. And I think to your point about using it for funding allocation, I think that's where maybe it would get a little trickier, but I don't know. I think we feel very strongly about the fact that that demographic is captured in the tool. And so as long as we've gotten the green light, we're gonna try and move it forward as much as we can.
And you make changes as necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a couple questions, some of them already been asked. So for the crash exposure, when we look at the crash by road users, like drivers, pets, bicyclists, because when you talk about the multimodal exercise, that means people use different modes. In that way, actually, you want to talk, I'm thinking about it, like talk about multimode in a safe environment. Then crash exposure actually a good indicator to say, okay, whether biking, walking is safe in that environment. And have there any data be categorized in that way?
It's like what the demographics of
The type of their users in the crash
The crashes.
exposure?
Yeah, there is talk of this actually, and so with the SWITers or I know we're not supposed to do acronyms, and I'm forgetting exactly what that acronym is, but the California Highway Patrol data set that our data is derived from, there is a sort of a combined data set of that does have like racial and ethnic information of the road users or those that were involved in crashes. There was kind of concern over with our leadership over a lot of that data. The information there was kind of incomplete and is sometimes like we're basically assuming that someone, CHP officer on the side of the road just inputted that correctly if they did at all. And so we want to be really, really careful there to not use sort of incomplete or data that would lead to different conclusions. So we talked about doing it this summer, and there was concerns raised about that, but it's potentially something to look at.
My second question is when there is the definition of ratio of multimodal exercise. Carolyn already asked that was calculated by travel time. Is that right?
Sort of travel time is a component of that, but it's looking at so if we're standing here and it's measuring all the potential say jobs that we could get to from here in an hour, and then decay weighting those jobs by how far they are. So then you just have a big sum of probably like 200 or 300,000 jobs, or it seems right for Sacramento database, but so it's just taking that measurement of how many actual opportunities you can get to and comparing what those sums are essentially between multimodal and auto. And so if you saw there, like the top ratio, the best access multimodal part of the state, it's about a third.
Yeah, because we talk about multimodal, that means both demand and supply side. If we calculate travel time, that's actually their demand side. Then if they're if their transit service is calculated travel time by transit, if there's no transit service at all, that part could be missing data in that indicator, like supply side of the infrastructure in general.
Yeah, so that's a good concern. That's specifically why we're looking at why we're defining multimodal as transit and walk, because the way the routing engine works essentially is it finds the shortest path between the origin and destination, and it includes a certain amount of walk time assumed in there. So usually that walk time is going to be eaten up by if the quickest trip involves just taking the bus, you have to walk to and from the bus. That's going to be your walking. You're going to take the bus, but if you have no bus service, but your destination can be walked to in 20 minutes, it'll route you just walking, and it'll decay that. Walking time decays out quicker, so it's more of like a time penalty, reflecting that it's hard to do in some cases. But that's just, and then the bike one gets tricky because it's like bike is less interchangeable in that because it's faster, and so that's kind of where we're developing a separate screen.
Yeah, I don't have answer to this question too. I'm just curious.
No, it's a good, that's specifically why we're doing those together as one bike or transit walking, because it kind of mostly solves that issue.
Thank you.
So there's a few questions online that I'll get to. We'll go back to. So a couple related questions about the crash data. One question or this was one comment more than a question. That SWITRS, which is the statewide integrated traffic record system. That's the acronym. Is only as reliable as the police reported information, and a related question about comment about crashes is that if you include no injury and slight injury reports, you decrease the number of crashes. So what, I guess, turning that into a question, sort of how are you accounting for some of the limitations of the crash data in the index?
So for the first question, for the just information only being as good as how it's inputted, that's why we're kind of avoiding going a little bit deeper on some of the other attributes in that data set, as I mentioned before. But it is sort of the only available data we need to do something. And so we are using it. I would say with the specific issue of the SWITRS data set does include property damage only crashes, and then the TIMS one sort of removes those. And that's an important data point of here's a bunch of crashes that didn't luckily result in anything catastrophic, but still indicative of an issue. We're kind of working through internally right now some just data quality issues with both those data sets. The thing that TIMS does really well, so the UC Berkeley data set, is just geolocates those active transportation crashes that are not geolocated. They have street names and stuff, but not the XY coordinates in all cases for the SWITRS set. So we're kind of working with our internal folks to try to make that more useful because we'd like to include more if possible. But we felt like at this point, just in this initial stage, we really wanted to capture all of the active transportation crashes, especially of vulnerable road users. It's kind of a key priority.
So going up on the note, those two notes on active transportation. So do you intend to include all road users in the count of, you have a DT from truck in here, but do you intend to include count of all road users rather than only motor vehicles?
Well, at this point, no, because it's not really a count of road users, it's a count of burdens. The ADT is just being used to calculate what are the burdens associated in terms of noise, pollutants, and crashes to some extent, although we're looking at that separately, of cars. And so bikes and pedestrians don't have those emissions and those same factors. So maybe it's some sort of weighting factor in a different context. I could see that being useful, but we're including ADT not as just a count of users, but as a source of externalities.
Carolyn, if you want to answer your question.
Yeah, it's very true. Why did you choose 20% ratio between transit and walking versus car? Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one of those thresholds that the point you raised earlier is kind of, it's people decide that it could be subject to biases. It's a really hard threshold to set for the access stuff because it tends to sort of concentrate in certain areas of the state. And so, for example, right now, not a lot of San Francisco is covered in this because it's the way we're measuring it compared to just the rest of the state. San Francisco has pretty good multimodal access, but that's an issue. There are accessibility issues in San Francisco, and it's been presented to us. So that's kind of one of the reasons we're bringing the bike stuff to try to get a more nuanced picture. So I mean, we'll continue to work on this stuff, but the problem, for example, at a simple level of just how we've operationalized it right now is if you identify that, okay, lack of coverage in San Francisco is a problem, and we want to change that to cover more of San Francisco, then you're kind of going to be covering the rest of the state. And so it's kind of balancing the needs of coverage, distributed versus overall coverage. I'd say that's just a difficult technical question. And the 20% number is just kind of what we played around with, trying a lot of different ones that generally captures most of those downtown areas and kind of some of the station areas of high frequency transit. But can certainly be subject to change in the future.
Let me go ahead and wait to ask your question, and then let me get to just a couple more online. That'll probably.
So there's a slide you show the spatially the community identified by the index. And then there's slides show public engagement plan audience. So I wonder if there are any plans to obtain comments and feedback from the communities you have identified in this index.
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of your question?
There's two slides
Okay.
in the presentation. One shows the community identified by this index as the community of concern and people of concern. And then there's one slide about the public engagement. Maybe I missed anything, like I didn't say a category that come from the residents or population in that community, whether this index can help them in any ways, or do they have any comments or feedback about it?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's a good question. So I think with our engagement plan currently as it stands, we are really looking at getting some of the subject matter experts and end users of the tool in conversation with us. And so that could include, of course, folks that will be captured in the tool, right? And I think you're referring to the priority populations that we've been talking about. However, we don't, to your point, we don't have additional public sessions that are just open to, general community members. All the sessions are open to the public. And maybe that's something to consider as we move into the next iteration of the tool and getting feedback, just to make sure, to your point earlier, that folks that are going to essentially be affected by the use of this tool are also in conversation with us. So I guess they're not mutually exclusive, right? So the target audiences that we had listed, perfect. To your point about community representation, we would ideally be in conversation with the groups that are working in partnership with communities or in service of communities. So local community-based organizations and other non-governmental organizations, a lot of our environmental justice advocates, things like that, especially tribal governments. So a lot of those groups, we've tried to streamline this in a way that we are interfacing with the groups that serve these populations. But everyone is welcome to show up to these sessions if they would like. So anybody from the public is obviously included. But maybe, to your point, maybe we need to add additional sessions where it's just general community.
Yeah, my question just come from because in one slide you show the potential use of the tool, that one potential function would be prioritize the projects, right? Like transportation projects. A lot of times when people propose or kind of construct the roads in one community, then in the public meetings, there's a lot of feedback, comments, pushback from the residents of that community. So I think similarly to this too, it would be helpful when, like, say how the residents there are thinking about it, that actually helps to really prioritize the projects when getting done to the ground in terms of their projects or something very practical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, your point is well taken. And I think we'll continue to expand our public engagement around the tool, as different iterations come out. So I think that's something to consider. And we have a lot of other equity efforts that are ongoing at Caltrans as well. So I think these are some other touch points where we would have opportunities for folks to weigh in on the tool and interface with us and, give us their feedback. So for example, last year we concluded a series of statewide listening sessions, not specific to the EQI, but just in terms of reaching communities that have been harmed by our transportation system. And so that was a really good model of how, we could do these sessions where we are talking to the public, getting their feedback, understanding their priorities and their needs. And I think something like that could fit well with the implementation of this tool as well.
Thank you.
So we really are just about at time. So there's still a ton of questions in the Q&A, and maybe folks who still have questions can get in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Directly, and hopefully you'll be able to answer those questions. But I really want to thank you, both of you, for coming and talking to us and holding a sort of focus group of sorts to explain the tool and take some feedback. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this works out in practice. So thanks again.
Thank you.